Let's make your Pilates, bar, and yoga workouts more effective. So, welcome everyone. I'm really excited for you to join myself and Jen Chestnut, aka Coach Jen, over here with us today. Say hi so they can see you.
Hello.
So, today, we're going to talk about some of the positives, some of the negatives, and things to be aware of when it comes to Pilates and bar and yoga training. And I know there are so many different styles out there, right? My background is in more, the newer style of Pilates training. We'll kind of talk about that versus the traditional Pilates. And so there's so many different things. So just because we are talking about them, maybe you're like, oh, well, that's not the way that I'm taught. That's fine. That's great. But maybe it is. And so there are things to just bring into your awareness, because I am all about really helping you to make your exercise, your workouts, your movement practice so much more effective, right? If we think, oh gosh, we could do the same movements and make them twice as effective, or, whatever the time might be, like, let's do it. Okay. So let's start with talking about what are some of the positives that we can see out of Pilates, bar, and yoga, type training, type workouts. So one thing I tend to see a lot of is we talk a lot about lengthening through our body, which is great. I do a lot of teaching of that. And so that's something that I love about those styles of training is we're creating more space between our bones, right? We're focusing on also articulating through our body and through our spine versus moving so rigid and stiff, right? Another one that can be really amazing with our Pilates, bar, and yoga training is that it improves our breath, right? I feel like a lot of the movement is very breath focused. And again, some styles might be more so than others. I also really feel like it's good for, stretching. We're going to talk about stretching a lot more because there's some good stretching that happens and maybe some not so effective stretching that we see happening. But also be really good for improving posture. It's one thing a lot of people tend to gravitate towards Pilates for, because they're like, oh, I hear it can help my back, or I hear it can help my posture, right? So that's one thing in general that Pilates we know is really good for. Yoga tend to be known a little bit more for stretching. And then, there's a lot of more back extension based exercises, right? Because we spend so much time sitting in a flex position, rounded forward, which restricts our breathing, not so great for our posture. So doing a lot of opening and extension type movements are taught a lot in Pilates and yoga. So those are some of the things I love. Jen, is there anything else you want to add to that before we get into some misconceptions and things to be aware of and things that we can improve upon?
I think the additional extension exercises is also one of my absolute favorite, because most people don't do enough of that opening up and extension. And this can be a pro and a con, but typically these kind of workouts are thought to be more gentler on the joints, on the body, if taught properly.
Yes. And that really is the key. And so if you've listened to the previous 3 parts of our exercise education series here, you may notice a little repetition, but you're also going to notice that there's really good things about different styles of training. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to how are you doing them, right? So let's get into that. Let's get into some of the misconceptions. Also, within that are things that we can just be working to improve upon to make your Pilates, your yoga, your bar practice that much more effective for you and your body. So I'm going to let Jen start us. So start with our tucking of the pelvis.
Yes, I think the biggest thing that is taught improperly, but it's across the board everywhere. And not everywhere. There are some instructors who have learned the difference and they don't teach it, but you're always told to tuck the pelvis or grip that booty or, contract the glutes.
Squeeze. Squeeze. I like squeeze. Like squeeze is like
Yes.
a big cue. I feel like we hear a lot of.
Yes. And when you learn how to properly connect that pelvic floor, if you are properly connected and you all of a sudden tuck your pelvis, you're going to feel that connection go away. And same with if you're connected in your deep core. And again, if you're connected in the pelvic floor and deep core properly, and you try to grip your glutes, you feel it go off. And if you're used to feeling your body, you're going to feel your obliques kick in. So you shut off the important muscles that we're really trying to train and to use, because when you can get a good pelvic floor connection and a proper deep core connection, that really helps take away all the ailments throughout your body. You know, people be like, oh, I blew out my knee, I need to do knee specific rehab. Well, you do proper pelvic floor and deep core connection with good movement, and you can rehab any body part.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of knees, right, a lot of that comes from our pelvis. So if we aren't addressing our pelvis and pelvic function and alignment with any sort of aches and pains in our body, we are potentially and most likely really missing a big key piece in that. And I know in bar, and I know not all bar styles teach this, but a lot of them do. Because for years, when I have new clients come my way, and I hear that they have a history of doing a lot of bar classes, one of the first things I do with them is get her to start to bring more awareness to her pelvis and start untucking your pelvis. Now, ladies, if you notice you tuck your butt and you grip the glutes and all that, don't overcorrect. Anything that we talk about, this is something really important to understand. If you all of a sudden start to like, oh, okay, I'm tucking my butt, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to try not to tuck my butt, and you overextend an arch in your low back, well, then you're just going to throw tension into your low back. So in order to work to get our pelvis in a more ideal position, again, we're not working on perfection, but we really don't want to be walking around and exercising a lot with a tucked pelvis, okay? Because it leads to, like Jen said, those sticky, grippy glutes, shuts off the pelvic floor. So instead, in bar classes, instead of tucking your pelvis, thinking about keeping a little bit more of a neutral pelvis to even a little bit of an anterior pelvis, where you will have a little bit more arch in your low back, but you should never feel back pain. Ever, 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 ever. And that is a sign that something's not connected right. We need to make a little tweak to posture, connection, all of that. But if you ladies can think about, oh gosh, I want to feel my hamstrings. I want to feel underneath those sits bones. I mean, Jen, we have these conversations all the time, right? Women don't know what their sits bones are. And you can tell me all day long, Erica, I don't have any bones underneath my bum and all that. They are there. I promise you that. But what's happened is we get so tight and restricted because we've been tucking our pelvis for so long that we don't actually know how to get this nice spreading between our sits bones and our pelvic floor. And I will tell you, when you start to discover that, like this whole like new magical, space of your body starts to open up, and you start to discover, oh, wow, there's this hamstring, pelvic floor, deep core connection that you've never experienced before. So it's again, finding and paying attention to pelvic positioning is really, I think, one of the most important things. If we can work to get our pelvis, again, not in a perfect position. And I will say most women do better with a slight anterior tilt. Men may do better with a neutral pelvis. And I know even in Pilates, like I was trained a lot of neutral pelvis. And again, what is specific neutral for one or one person to another? We can find the exact neutral, but here's what I want you all to pay attention to. I want you to find that position that works well for your body, and it can change. In the beginning, if you're really tucked, you might find, gosh, even going to a neutral hurts your back. So because you're too tight, we got to open that up, but you'll get there. And eventually you'll probably get to a place where you're like, gosh, I actually feel my pelvic floor a lot more when I am slightly anterior, which is when you have a little bit more arch in your low back. And I know some of you listening some of you already have probably almost too much of an anterior tilt in your pelvis. But if that feels fine for you, then there's nothing wrong with that, right? Making sure we're connecting correctly. So, okay, we'll get off the tucking of the pelvis because we just need to do a whole class on that.
Seriously.
Right, Jen? But anyway, just some things to be aware of, because that's a big thing that I see all the time. Okay, so I want to talk about the next one is the over exercising of the abs. So I know our part 3 was about core. So I don't want to go too much into that. If you haven't listened to part 3, go back to that. Jen and I talked a lot about overdoing ab exercises and stuff, but that is also something I see a lot of in Pilates, potentially in bar, and yoga. Again, it's going to kind of depend on the style and what you're doing. if we think of traditional Pilates, like there's a lot of flexion in Pilates, and I'm not anti-flexion, but we want to be making sure that we're feeling the right connections so that we're not just tucking our pelvis and jamming our back into the ground. And this also leads us in with that belly to spine cue, right? Which again, we talked a lot about that last episode as well. So listen to that if you haven't. But something to really be aware of is if we're already always drawing inward and pushing into our back, we're not tapping into our fascial system near as much as we should be. We're not getting that nice lengthening and connection from the pelvic floor through the lower belly. So while you might be feeling like, oh, maybe this is giving me more of a six pack and stronger abs because it's how we've always been taught, it actually can lead to a lot of imbalances in the body. So again, not saying that all flexion is bad, and we can do some if your body is ready for it, doing it in the right way with the right breath work, with the right pelvic position and the right connection, but not overdoing flexion. And that's for me why the way that I teach the Pilates, I always call it Pilates infused, because yes, those of you that have done any of my workouts, you'll notice, yes, there's a Pilates element to it, but a lot of it's taught a very different, because in my 20 years I've been doing this, it's amazing the amount of women I've worked with, and they're like, oh, I love your style of Pilates. How do I find someone with your techniques? And I'm like, well, I've kind of gone off the path a little bit with Pilates, even the way I was taught, because I've discovered fascia and pelvic floor, and we've pulled all these modalities in. And again, it's always evolving. I'm always learning new things, discovering new ways to move and improve it. But just recognizing that just because we're taught to do a lot of flexion, that you can learn to modify that. Keep your pelvis in a little bit more of that neutral to slight anterior, providing your back feels fine. Your range is going to be smaller, and we have to initiate with our breath, and we have to think about what's happening with our ribs, because how many of you do flexion and you pull on your neck? Right? The shoulders go up and you're like, oh, my neck, right? We should not be lifting with our neck. Our neck is there to stabilize, and we want to lengthen through, and we want to lift from the lower abdomen, pelvic floor, deep core, and lift with our ribs and slide our ribs to our pelvis, not into our back, right? So we've got to remember we're always lengthening. And anytime we can, I said that was like a really good positive of all these modalities, but for some reason, when we go into flexion, we forget to lengthen. We just go, oh, we got to flex. No, we want to lengthen and then flex. Okay. Let's move on and talk about stretching. Jen, I'll let you start this one.
So this was an eye opener to me, because, especially coming from the strength coach realm and the athletic training realm, where for decades I've worked with athletes or even injured people, and we stretch to lengthen these muscles, or, to give them more power, to take away the tightness in an area. Well, when we teach traditional stretching, as does some yoga, and again, it's not all, but we teach people just to fall and fold into the stretch. So if you just think of the good old quintessential sit on your bum, legs straight out in front of you, hamstring stretch, right? We fall over, we fold over, we relax if we can get into a relaxed place. But if you change that stretch and you lengthen through a stretch, you not only tell the muscles that, oh, it's okay, it's safe to be this far, but you also create new muscle nerve ending connections, not connections, but more signals that lets your body remember it can relax a little bit more. So like in that same folded forward position, now instead of just falling into it, try to think of lengthening through your heels. So like you're trying to make your legs longer, and then lengthen through your trunk and your head as you're leaning forward. And you get a much deeper stretch that's getting into all of those tissues and the fascia, but it has a progressive attribute to it. Whereas a standard stretch, you don't get as much progression in lengthening as you would when you're active in your stretch.
Yeah. And I love doing yoga, and I'm really picky, really, really, really picky with who I will do yoga with, who teaches me, because it has to be all about lifting up out of our joints, lifting up out of our pelvis, and then moving, right? I see I see so many people getting injured because they're so focused on going deeper and deeper and deeper, when actually going deeper is what's leading to injury, instead of focusing on, I want to lift up and lengthen, and don't worry about going deep. We have to stop going so deep in our poses. That might be something you want to work towards. That's great. But at the end of the day, if we don't understand why we're doing something, we're just like, oh, we want to get deeper in the pose. Well, for what reason? Are you feeling the right connections? Are you feeling that pelvic floor? Are you feeling the space in your hips? Right? As women, I feel like, and I would even say men get really tight in their hips because they tend to have narrower pelvises. Or if you're a woman has a really narrow pelvis, like I do, we can really stiff and stuck in our pelvis, or imbalances, right? No matter the shape, size of your pelvis, get a lot of imbalances in our pelvis. So I love yoga moves and things like that to help balance our pelvis. But if we're always so fixated on getting deep into a warrior pose or whatever it might be, we're missing so much potential to actually work on creating stability and strength deep inside of our pelvis. And so when we can change our perspective on it and think, okay, I'm going to go to my next yoga class and I'm going to go, well, maybe you need to go slower than what you're being taught. Or maybe sometimes you need to come up out of a pose because they're holding it too long. Maybe sometimes you're like, okay, I'm going to start a little higher in a pose and let my tissue open, but you're going to be connected. And this is the really cool thing that with fascia. Okay, so fascia likes to be worked more gently. It also likes to be connected. Okay. And so that's why when Jen was saying, right, with that just traditional kind of forward fold, and you're just like, you body just like stretches and relaxes completely, your fascial system isn't activated, but you'll actually get a deeper stretch and a better stretch and a more effective stretch when you lengthen, lift, and then stretch. It's that same idea. If we're always lifting up out of our pelvis, we're always trying to find space and we're trying to connect, and we've got tensegrity is really the word, where we can feel oppositions through our body. And then we're working into the poses, or we're working into the different exercises, whatever it might be with any of the modalities. Then all of a sudden you start to feel stronger. Your back starts to release, your hip flexors start to release, like all these areas that were grippy and grabby before. Why do our muscles get grippy and grabby? A lot of times it's because they're trying to support something, like they're trying to support, for example, your back is tight because something else in your body is not strong enough to stabilize you. Right. And we get a lot of people that have SI joint stuff. Well, why do we have SI joint stuff? Because we're maybe not stable enough in one side of our pelvis and we're really tight and restricted on the other. We get all these back and forth going on. But when we can recognize, oh gosh, let's actually take the movements we're doing, bring more awareness to them, and really focus on that lengthening and not just going deep into a stretch. And you're going to actually get so much more out of it because your body likes to feel supported in the stretches. And like all of a sudden then your nervous system is like, oh gosh, now I can relax. Because if you're just fully relaxed and you've got any nerves kind of getting pinchy in between your bones, your vertebrae and your SI joint and all that, then what happens? The body goes, oh, I got to grip and grab tighter. So we want to actually teach it how to support and be strong. Okay. We got to talk about twisting.
Well, before you go into twisting, to go along with what you said, so this like all segues, to go with what you said about that SI joint. The problem is we are getting so loosey-goosey in our lumbar spine because one, we're not connecting, we're not using that fascia, that lifting, that lengthening, and because we sit so much or we're so forward movement based, our thoracic spine, our mid back starts to lock down in our rib cage. And so when we should be doing some twisting from our ribs, we just immediately dump into the low back and we start moving. And that gaps, every time you do that, you gap that SI joint because you're getting extra range of motion because you don't have that deep core, that pelvic floor strength, which goes straight into the rotation movements.
Yeah. And I love rotation. Jen and I love rotation. Rotation
Yes.
is some of my favorite, but you have to do it in a way that is not twisting your SI joint, which means when you're doing, so let's talk about Pilates. Let's start there. So, I was always taught there's an exercise where you can sit on a box or cross your legs and you're sitting and you've got the straps and you're twisting like this, right? Now, I'm not saying it's a bad exercise, but it's not as ideal of an exercise as when you're up on your knees. I haven't taught that exercise in a really, really, really long time, because when I started understanding more and more about the pelvic floor and deep core and SI and all that. So if you're up on your knees and now your pelvis and your ribs can move together, right? We're getting oppositions. We're getting that nice rotation and fluid movement, and your hips can go with you. We should never, ever, ever be doing rotation where we are seated and our pelvis is stuck. Okay. If you even think about from a functional movement, like one thing that comes to mind, like, okay, if you're sitting in your car and you've got to reach around to get to your kid, well, if you're reaching to the right, that left hip is going to come up a little bit. There is really never a movement in life where we are just going to be stuck and sitting and rotating. Because even if you're going to rotate, you're going to feel your weight shift and move. So
the body's not meant to be stuck.
No, we are meant to move, but we have to move in a right way. So that's just a Pilates example, something that I changed a lot over the years. And I teach a lot of standing rotations and all that because it feels so good on your body. And it actually really helps rebalance. Now, we have to talk about yoga for a minute. So twisting, again, because I get clients who end up injuring themselves because they twisted too hard or someone pushed them and all that. So when we're twisting, the most important thing we have to do is make sure that we are allowing movement through our pelvis. Okay. We have to lengthen, and we want to think about that movement coming from our rib cage and not from our low back. And it might mean that one side you can twist a lot deeper, and the other side you might go, oh my gosh, I'm like stuck. I can't move. Do not force it. When we force twisting and we force ranges of motion, that's where injury happens. And I know so many times we might see someone else in a class like, I want to be like them and go so deep, but you don't know they're doing it right. Just because it looks good or correct or pretty or whatever, like it doesn't mean it's actually working well for their body. They might be in a lot of pain, but they don't know it. And maybe they're not. And maybe they're just super flexible. Maybe they're hypermobile too. And you're not. It's right. And there's something with hypermobility too. We still want to make sure that we're really lengthening, connecting, and then moving, right? So for those of you that have hypermobility, like it's just as important, but kind of for different reasons, right? So twisting, I love twisting. Twisting's so good. It's so good for our lymph system. It's so good for our organs. I love it. But we want to make sure that the twisting is not coming from our back. And you might find, and especially some yoga twisting, right? You may find like if you feel oppositions and you feel like your hip, you may find you have to kind of manipulate that a little bit, and you've got to go a little higher. Higher is really the key in yoga to getting up higher. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I can lengthen out through my hip. I get some space, and now I can actually rotate in my ribs, where if you go deeper, right, your hips are stuck. And then your ribs are like, okay, well, I can do a little movement, but I feel it in my SI joint. You do not ever want to feel anything in your SI joint ever. And if you've got, maybe you're someone who's had SI joint for a long time, we can help you with that. We love that, right, Jen? We love helping people get out of SI joint dysfunction. And many times it's not the SI joint's fault. The SI joint is getting just cranked up all the time. Maybe the pelvis is imbalanced. We talked about other things that can contribute to it. It's just a really, really common one. Anything else with twisting I didn't say you want to add?
No, when you think of yoga and why some people end up with that low back pain, it's because you are doing that twisting where you're staying down deep and you're not lengthening up, and you're over twisting, but then you hold that position. So you're leaving that SI joint, which is like a little canal in your spine, and you're gapping it, or you're rubbing it on other parts of, either the sacrum's rubbing on the pelvis or vice versa, and you start to create bone spurs, and that just creates more and more issues in there.
Yeah, which is why even from a prevention perspective, even if you're like, well, I don't feel any pain, this information is so important so we can prevent. Prevention is amazing. I just think for some reason, so many times our body, it doesn't bring as much awareness until we have pain. So anyone listening that does no pain, like start really paying attention to all these things that we've talked about so you can prevent dysfunction, and you'll actually make your workouts so much more effective. Okay, the last thing we have to talk about is the potential negative effect on the pelvic floor, which we've kind of woven in. I just want to make sure we call it out. This is something, obviously discovered over the years. Pelvic floor comes up in everything. And we say the pelvic floor conversation kind of found me because it's so involved in everything. And if we're not aware of, again, positioning of our pelvis, what are we doing if we're doing flexion exercises, extension even, right? So many times with extensions, which we do a lot of in Pilates and in yoga, which is great, that we want to be making sure that we are not just dumping into the low back. Like, are we feeling that light pelvic floor, lower belly connection? And we're lengthening and lifting more into the mid back, but we're lengthening and creating more stability in our lower back, right? So that we're strengthening it, but it shouldn't be the low back is doing all the work. And if we're not able to extend and feel a light pelvic floor, lower belly lift, then it's time to probably shorten your range of motion, focus more on lengthening. And we teach this in core rehab, right? We will have clients that will be like, I don't even lift off the ground. I'm like, yeah, that's good. I want you to not hardly move first. So you get that feeling of lengthening and then barely working into extension so that you actually start to do extension correctly. And it's just so amazing that we've got to pull our motion back. We've got to go slower. We've got to go smaller. We've got to really start to hone in on what we're doing. And then when you start to make these little changes, your pelvic floor can start to function better. Your deep core, you're going to have more space, you're going to have more movement. And before you know it, you will become more flexible, but without pain, without dysfunction, and you'll feel so much more stable. So let's kind of recap on, some of these top tips here, right? We talked about pelvic positioning, right? So ladies, pay attention to that pelvic position. A little bit anterior can be amazing. And for most of you, that's probably what's going to feel good. And again, remember, there's no such thing as a perfect pelvis or posture. And we're always working on this journey to improving our deep core, connection. Okay. When we're doing flexion, let's start paying attention to pelvic position within that, but we're lengthening to do flexion. Okay. Instead of just jamming and pushing everything into our back. And paying attention that we can feel our pelvic floor and stretching. I think this is one of our biggest ones we haven't really talked about too much yet is stretching. Like, it's fascial. I call it fascial lengthening in all of our programming, right? And it's people are like, I want to stretch. I want more stretches, Erica. I'm like, okay, well, fascial lengthening is your stretching, AKA stretching. It's because we want to be active. And the more you can practice being active through your stretches, it will help you so much in the long run. Actually, you'll probably start to feel a huge difference like pretty quickly. And then really the last one is twisting, paying attention to our twisting motions. Where are you feeling it? Do you need to lengthen more? Do you need to shorten your range of motion right now? Do we need to, just come up out of that pose or that move a little bit? So just bringing more awareness to those things, even if you just pick one right now, can absolutely make your Pilates, your bar, your yoga style workouts really so much more effective for your body. And we didn't really talk much about breathing. Again, so many of these avenues, Jen, we got to come back on and have more conversations about. But ladies and any men watching, thank you all for tuning in. I want to let you all know about my free pelvic floor guide, because, if you have not had a chance to look at it, haven't signed up for it yet, it's definitely a must learn about. Understanding more about your pelvic floor is going to help you with so much other movement and breath work and all of that. So you can find it on my website. It's ericazeal.com/pelvic floor. So reach out if any of you have any questions, and thanks so much for tuning in today.